Now let's take a moment to discuss male sexual power versus female sexual power. If we're going to discuss women in power in the ancient world, and we're going to make a clear division between women and men, then we need to start to talk about sexuality. How does this work? What does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a woman? This is much more complex than some of you might guess. You might think, oh, it's very easy. It's binary. You're either a woman or you're a man. It is not easy biologically. There are intersex sexualities. There is hermaphroditism, a more extreme example. But sexuality is very much a gradient. And so I want to qualify at the beginning that this isn't black or white. You're not either male or female. There is a gradient. There are many places on the spectrum where you can fall within male sexuality or female sexuality. But assuming that we're talking about a male whose reproductive organs work in an expected way, who's falling within the center of the gradient of what it means to be masculine, let's discuss male sexual power first before we get to the female and try to understand if we're talking about biological determinism, dangerous thing to focus on, because you might say, oh, females deserve to be lesser in society because their bodies are weaker, their brains are different, they have to have all of these babies. Of course they're not going to be able to have power in society. If people are saying these things, even in more veiled ways, if this is something that people might use to keep women from power, then I'd rather focus on it directly. Discuss what are the biological realities for males in terms of sexuality, what are the biological realities for females in terms of sexuality. Compare the two and see how this works. So male sexual power, I think we can characterize first by saying the sexual dimorphism determines that the male is bigger and more powerful than the female, which means that if he wants, he can be aggressive sexually. He can take sex if he wants. He can rape more easily than a female can. So sexuality can be something that can be aggressively gotten by the male. It would be very difficult for a female to do such a thing against a male along our gradient of what is male and what is female. The male has the power and ability to produce multiple procreations outside of himself. Now, what I mean by that is he's not going to be dealing with having just one baby a year, maybe two if he can have twins. No, he can, if he's very powerful, if he's a king, he can be married to hundreds of women simultaneously, and he can visit a different woman every night and create 365 babies in a given year, optimally, if he's a very energetic and able king. He doesn't have to worry about all of the physical changes that happen with a pregnancy. He doesn't have to worry about the doubling of the hormones every day and all of the mood swings that go along with that. He doesn't have to worry about the birth itself, a very dangerous and vulnerable time. You have to have this child come out of a very small cavity. He doesn't have to worry about any of that. The procreation is happening outside of him. He doesn't have to worry about nursing afterwards. He doesn't have to worry about his hormones changing as a child gets older. I'll discuss that more in a bit. It means that if you're talking about a king, biologically, a man is going to be, just economically, in terms of his production of children, much more appropriate, a much safer bet than any woman. Because if you're worried about succession, who's going to be king next? Do we have enough viable heirs? Does the king have sons? You want a man to be the one that's producing the children from whom that lineage will extend. A woman is going to put you in a more precarious position. But a man who could potentially have hundreds of children breeding outside of himself, that's your go-to for making sure that you're being risk-averse in your continuation of a particular power scheme. So the man has the power of being stronger. He can have multiple procreations. Those procreations happen outside of himself. And he has, and this is the cruelest part, longer-lived sexual ability compared to his female counterparts. So he can reproduce potentially until he's 70 years old. We can again look to Donald Trump and look at his production of his son Barron with a much younger wife, Melania. And this is something expected that in our society, this is something that we've come to see as normal, because biologically a man can reproduce until later in life, whereas a woman will go through menopause. So she will lose her procreative value and his will extend for a much longer period of time, thus extending his biological power, and then his power in the workplace, his power in the political arena, all of these other things will come with. Okay, now what about female sexual power? How does it differ from a man's? I think we can all think about it. It's pretty obvious. Much of what we hear about female sexual power is the miracle of birth. It's an amazing thing that a woman can have a baby. I've had a pregnancy myself. I have a son, and right now he's 7. I can talk about this because I've been through it. This pregnancy, the first trimester where you're exhausted, and I remember walking to class and having to rest from the parking lot to the building where my office was twice every time during those 3 months of the first trimester. Second trimester, hormones are still doubling every day, and you're feeling maybe more energy, but you start to forget things that you wouldn't normally forget. Simple words like, oh, what's that stick of wood that has stuff in it that you can write with? A pencil. So you get what's called mommy brain, which is very frustrating. Third trimester, you're fat and exhausted and you can barely walk, and you're supposed to be working throughout this entire process. Your hormones are changing, your mood is erratic and strange. Then when you go through the birth, it's one of the most brutal and horrific experiences people can undergo, some more than others. I had my son without any painkillers, so I know what it feels like, and I know what 10 hours of pain feels like. And more than that, I know what it was like after the birth, when I had to stay awake with a child who had problems nursing for hours and hours at a time. If people talk about sleep deprivation and torture, I know what that does to the human brain. I had postpartum anxiety, postpartum depression. I went through all of those emotional changes, and essentially I needed my workplace, UCLA, to step in, give me the time off that I needed to have the child, care for the child, go a little bit crazy, to be quite honest, and then come back to the workplace, able to step back into my position of professorial power. And I needed my workplace to do that for me. So what I'm trying to say is, for those of you, and I'm assuming it's many of you who have not had a child or not been part of that caretaking, it is the game changer. It's the thing that takes women out of power more than anything else. And it's why so many feminists, particularly early feminists, decided that the only way they could actually be a part of the masculine game was to opt out of having children at all. It's an option. And I know many women who decide they don't want children. That's a personal choice. I have close family members who decide they don't want children. Great. But if you do want children and you still want to be a woman in power, how do you deal with this? How do you transcend it? Essentially, we as a society have to decide to step in and caretake the woman who is caretaking. So getting back to the roots of female sexual power, yes, it is a miracle that we can give birth, but it is a debilitating miracle in terms of political, economic, military power. You have to go through the gestation. You have to go through the nursing. Meanwhile, as your child grows, you are matching your child in hormones. So my 7-year-old son, my feminine hormones actually match him at a different level than they did when he was 6, when he was 4, when he was 2, and when he was an infant. My hormones continue to change, tethering me to my child emotionally, physically, hormonally. It's an extraordinary thing that a male does not have to undertake. He doesn't have to be emotionally connected to this other being in the same way. He doesn't have to be physically connected to this other being in the same way. Now, when I was a young woman, I remember thinking, probably around the age of something precocious, 21, 22, that feminists, or so-called feminists, were angry and strident and difficult. And it wasn't until I'd experienced sexual harassment for the first time that I started to think a little differently. And it wasn't until I had my son that I realized the level of physical inequality that a woman has to deal with. So the pregnancy part, the ability to procreate is, I think, the chief game changer in terms of females and power. It is still something that can be transcended, but it is the game changer. The next game changer is that female sexual power, that ability to procreate, lasts for a very short time. She's only able to do it from a younger age than a man, from, say, the age of 9 or 10 even, up to the age of 35, 40 now. In the ancient world, let's say 30. So a very limited window to find power by having children with a husband, with another man, with maybe a powerful king as a member of a harem, something like that. But she's got limited time to make her mark. We'll talk about what happens after in a second. So we're dealing with female sexual power that's about beauty, youth, enticement. She can't overpower anyone. She can't be aggressive. Her body is smaller and weaker, so she's not going to be aggressive in any way. She has to use other behaviors to try to lure a man. And we might get then the impression, and we certainly have from ancient literature and Shakespeare, any book that you might pick up that talks about female beauty and attractiveness, the idea that female sexuality is a very dangerous thing, that it can make a man lose his mind. It can make a man do something that isn't in his best interest. This is something to be guarded against. You can find quotes about the dangers of female sexuality in a variety of cultures and a variety of different kinds of literature. So that should be no surprise. But it's a power that doesn't necessarily lend itself to the political arena. The chief sticking point for me, there are two. One, the hormonal fluctuations. So think back to that image that I showed you with all of the different happy faces. The happy face of the man, this nice bland continuity. He's always of the same even keel emotionality. And then the female happy face is going from happy to sad to crying to over the top joyous to whatever. These extreme fluctuations of emotionality. And these fluctuations are connected to hormonal fluctuations. They're connected to our ability to have children. And it gets really, really interesting when you look at the biology of it. So a woman who is ovulating actually has a more symmetrical face. She appears more beautiful to the people around her, men or women. And this can be measured and has been measured by biologists. The ovulating woman is also more amenable to other people. She's more accommodating. She's more willing to help you out. What can I do for you? How can I help you? Let me work with you. And that's something that is hormonally given to women. We may be acting like this whether we know it or not, but when you're ovulating, this is something that you're more likely to do than not. When a woman goes into her premenstrual phase and hormone levels change, she loses that amenability. She loses that accommodating factor. And many of the scientists who discuss this, and the one that I've liked the most and read the most is Julie Holland, who's written a number of books about this subject and these hormonal changes, will tell you that the female in PMS is there to clean house. She's not there to be your caretaker anymore. She's there to establish what her circumstances are in a more clear and cutting way, and to determine who needs to be cut loose, who needs to be included. So a woman's brain, when she's ovulating, is different from a woman's brain when she's premenstrual or on her period. And that right there is something that might be disturbing to many feminists who like to say that men are the same as women or that men can do exactly the same thing as women, particularly a second wave feminist, or maybe even a third wave feminist. As we move further in feminism and what that might entail in scholarship and how we look at it, taking the biological reality into the equation, I think is very useful, because once you establish that biologically men and women have different hormonal fluctuations or different emotionality, these things can be transcended in the workplace and in arenas of power. So game changer number one for me are those hormonal shifts for female sexual power. Game changer number two in terms of female sexual power is menopause. And here we're talking about the potential loss of all social value for a woman. Because think back when I talked about female sexual power and this idea that it's dangerous, it's something to ward against, it's something to steel yourself against if you're a man who's easily influenced by a beautiful woman, et cetera, et cetera. If that's the case, and that's our chief worry about female power, then why are we so upset about menopausal women potentially entering the arena of power? Women like Hillary Clinton, Maggie Thatcher, Theresa May, Angela Merkel. Why are women like that, menopausal women, still so threatening? They can't lure us with their sexual abilities. They don't have any ability to procreate anymore. So they've lost that sexual beauty. So why do we still find them so threatening? This is really interesting to me, and it brings up whales. Whales are one of the other species in our mammalian world that also goes through menopause. The females go through menopause. It's actually a very rare thing for animals to give up the ability to procreate years and years, even decades before death. It's a strange thing. It's a wasting of energy. Why live if you're not able biologically to reproduce? Humans do it. Whales do it. When whales go through menopause, scientists have established that those older female whales put their energies to find food, to protect, to caretake, into caretaking for their daughters and their daughters' offspring, almost solely. They're focusing in on their nuclear family. They're focusing in on their own offspring's offspring. They don't use their emotionality and their caretaking skills for everybody. They use their emotional and caretaking skills very pointedly for their own offspring's offspring. And this, I think, is a key. So that when we look at an older female who is entering an arena of power, somebody like Hillary Clinton, we might have the biological knee-jerk reaction, wait, she's not in it for everybody in society. She's not doing it for all of America, even though she says she is. She's just in it for her own selfish family reasons. She's not doing it for all of us. And so this is where my feminism comes back to the biological roots. Once we look at the biological roots directly in the eyes, determining, okay, this is why menopause happens, this is what the behaviors are of most menopausal mammals, then maybe we can transcend the distrust. Maybe we can look it in the eye squarely that we don't trust women because we think they're going to just be interested in their own family, and we can see that they themselves are able to transcend it. We ourselves will be able to transcend the misperception. In the same way that UCLA was able to help me transcend my pregnancy and postpartum anxiety and depression, we can transcend our knee-jerk reactions and hostility towards female power and our understanding that they're only in it for themselves or for their own family, and try to find a different perception of female power. Okay, so let's take this menopausal issue further, because if we're keeping it real, the women who have the most chance of finding power are women who have experience. I'm 45 years old. I'm now entering into my mid-career, and mid-level career people are the ones who are able to oversee other people in a staff situation, who are able to move up the hierarchy of power. The older I get, the more experience I have, ostensibly the more power I'll have, the more menopausal I get, right? So we have to look at this biologically and try to determine what human problems with this might be. So I see three problems with this in particular. Number one, there is little biological payoff for an older woman as she gains more and more power. And by that, I mean she can't get a ton of boyfriends by becoming president of the United States, or as past presidents have done with young females. She can't, if she becomes a leader of state in the ancient world, maybe becomes a female king of ancient Egypt, she can't fill up a harem with a bunch of young men. The idea of somebody like Maggie Thatcher or Hillary Clinton having a bevy of boyfriends because they reach a certain status in life is ridiculous. It's not the kind of biological payoff an older woman can expect. An older man, he can procreate until he's 70-something years old, so it is the kind of biological payoff a man can expect and still today, in many circumstances, does expect. But a woman's not going to get that. So there's the idea of, do we bar the woman from the arenas of power, or does the woman opt out because she doesn't benefit from all of the investment that you put into getting all of this power? If she doesn't get something back biologically, maybe there's no interest on her part. It's a possibility. So problem number 2, it's been shown in a variety of studies, and I have one that we'll be reading in this class together, that women have emotional differences from men. And we've talked about PMS versus ovulation, but it gets even more interesting than that. Evolutionary biology determines, along a gradient, always along a gradient, but it determines that females generally hold more grudges than men. So if a woman holds a grudge because somebody's cut her in a hunter-gatherer situation, maybe a cousin didn't bring back enough wild grains or wild berries, and so her children are hungry for that night. If somebody does something like that, grudge is built up. She cuts that person off because her survival is actually threatened. I think it's important that all of us human beings look at female differences in emotionality and male differences in emotionality so that we can transcend it. It's useful for me to see if I'm holding a grudge and to think, wait, Kara, you're not a hunter-gatherer. You're not trying to survive anything. You can have a beer with all of the gang and let it go and try to transcend that biological reality that might be a part of my female brain. But the problem number 2 is just this either real or perceived different emotionality between males and females, and the perceived over or unstable emotionality of the female. It's a problem for the premenopausal woman, and it's a problem for the postmenopausal woman. In a way, it's more of a problem for the postmenopausal woman, and here's problem number 3, is that once a woman leaves the cycles of ovulation, PMS, and period behind, and just goes into not even bothering with the estrogen and the progesterone rush, she's always going to be unaccommodating. She's always going to be seeing things in a straighter way. An older woman is less accommodating, less into appeasing the men around her. She's more likely to be perceived by society as what we might call a bitch, or somebody who's just rude to you, somebody who's short, somebody who's not smiling enough, somebody who's not trying to please you. And that is very much a hormonal difference between an older woman and a younger woman. And so as women in our society today reach a certain age where they can potentially take power, our perceptions of their emotionality might push back against that. So there are a number of problems that might preclude a woman from taking power in the world today. Now, here's another screenshot. And this one is from a study that looks at differences between male and female brain wiring. How might a man think versus a female think? Again, I'll present the caveat. All of this happens along a gradient. There are some women who think more like men and some men who think more like women. But within this rubric, more of a black and white kind of understanding, we see that the males tend to have stronger front-to-back circuitry. That means that they're better at perceiving space, knowing which way I go north or I go west. The game is here. Their brains are more wired for action. Maybe they might be better at video games. Maybe they might be better at flying a plane. We have to be really careful with stuff like this, because what's to stop the Air Force from saying, I know that men have better front-back circuitry than females, so we don't want any female fighter pilots. And I think we've been able to prove circumstantially that females are very capable of piloting planes and working video games as well. So all of these things, these biological determinisms need to be very, very carefully dealt with and transcended rather than thought of as gospel truth. Women's brains tend to have stronger circuits left to right across the hemispheres, which means that they have better reason and intuition. Anybody want to sit down with a 14-year-old boy and a 14-year-old girl and see who has better reasoning skills? Sit down with a man and a woman and see who has better intuition about what a person might do, having looked in somebody's face and talked with them. What's their mood? What's their emotionality? A woman's going to be better at reading that. But in terms of wayfinding, a woman has a hard time, in general, going north. A woman generally takes a certain path, goes up to the mailbox that has the red and blue markings, knows to take a right, and then knows to then take a left when you get to a particular street corner with another set of markings. And so a woman wayfinds, in general, in a different way than a man wayfinds. A woman's emotionality is different than a man's emotionality. All of these things need to be taken in a biological manner when we're discussing what is the difference between the male and the female, why can the female not have power in the political arena. Now, to complicate this even further, I want to discuss what's the difference between sex and gender. And here we have exploded the conversation into a cacophony of scholarly discussion where academics who work on these topics get into very heated arguments with one another about what sexual power is, what gender power is, what sexual identification is, what gender identification is. To keep it simple, let's go ahead and say that sexual identification is biologically determined, and gender identification is socially or culturally determined. In a way, what we've just entered into is the minefield of nature versus nurture. And this is something that will feed into all of our readings and all of our discussion as we move forward with this first week.